the debate. In the terms of timekeeping, I will be posting timestamps in the chat for first 7, 8, and 8:15 minutes. Also be mindful of the time and try to deliver your speeches in that time span. I think that's pretty much it. So without any further ado, I would like to invite the Prime Minister to start. In terms of timekeeping, I will be posting. Okay, thank you so much, Anastasia. Yeah, Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
I would like to prefer verbal POIs because I won't be looking at the chat. Panel, in the status quo, the LGBTQIA+ movement implicitly, but in many cases explicitly considers religion as a burden, as an enemy. They view it as a barricade in front of them that is stopping them from achieving their goal of absolute equality. This anti-religion rhetoric in the movement does not help achieving the purpose of its members. It only creates another burden for them by allowing the movement to become a scapegoat and target of the populist ultra-conservatives. We believe that the reinterpretation of movements like the public agenda will not preach that religion is purely good and that the churches should be followed at all costs. It will simply be neutral towards it, seeing the flaws and accepting its importance and good qualities. In a sense, the movement will make peace with religion, and by this will not speak against, not for it, nor for it, because this is what equality is: living together, knowing and respecting each other without pressuring anything on each other. The movement will vouch for the freedom to access and practice religion, whatever your sexuality happens to be. So what am I going to do in this speech? Firstly, some characterization on the movement. Secondly, on what centering looks like. Thirdly, on religious people, our metric, and then two arguments. The movement's characterization is that they seek to get acceptance, inclusion, and equal rights for the people who are affected. So how would this centering look like on our side of the house? So the primary attack on the LGBTQIA+ community is coming from people who are religious fundamentalists, a small but loud group of people who, due to their aggressive and oversimplifying agents, are able to radicalize and influence tons of people. By centering the reinterpretation of religions on its public agenda, the most important platform of shaping perception, by the way, the LGBTQIA+ community takes the wind out of the ultra-conservative sail. It would disable and make those claims even more groundless, and the LGBTQIA movement would be able to establish a bridge over the trenches of contemporary radicalized identity politics. Now, secondly, on religious people. So people in general do not use their energy to attack someone they don't know for one of their traits unless they feel threatened. So what is threatening in the LGBT movement is that they think the movement is attacking their lifestyle. They think that the movement is coming for them, and this is why this is because of the anti-religion aspect of the religion. So what is our metric in this debate? Firstly, we would like to get more inclusivity for the LGBTQIA+ movement, its members, and especially religious gay people for the sake of intersectionality. So now to our first argument on how we get more acceptance. So the status quo, there's a clash of LGBT and religion, right? This is what we call it in the framing. They are framed as mutually exclusive. And the primary attack on the LGBT is that it's against religion, right? Therefore, it's withholding more people from supporting this community. So the problem of the religious people with LGBT is not the fact that they exist or that they would be harmed by them, but that it violates their religion. So in the status quo, a lot of religious communities view gay people as sinners, right? Because it is against the religion. This is what they claim. So the LGBT view on religion in the status quo is that they also believe, again, in the mutual exclusivity. They reject religion as a form of countering, not taking the push from the religious group. And the LGBT community on this side doesn't discourage religion. On our side, it realizes its importance in many people's life because it no longer attacks it no longer has an attack on religion as a whole. The movement is now only in opposition to those religious individuals who are expressing active hatred toward the community, to those who are doing active harm, right? Because the movement itself does not generalize against another group, which makes it less hypocritical. So how do we get more acceptance? Two layers here. Firstly, in the status quo, religious people view gay people as their enemy, and this is partly because of their type of religion. And when the movement starts talking about how they do not oppose religion, how there are fundamentally good parts of religions the religion that they support, like for instance, love your neighbor, for instance, they no longer feel that they are being attacked by the movement, and that in conjunction with religious leader like the Pope starting to be more supportive of gay people is likely to lead to less opposition on both sides, since there are some values which both can agree on, right? Secondly, religious gay people are more likely to go to church if they are not shunned by the movement, right? This means, for instance, more direct exposure for these groups to members of the movement. And this is good because they can see that they are individuals and human beings who deserve love and respect. So how does this work? People are more likely to be afraid of things they don't know anything about, right? And that is just that they just heard bad things about, right? And this can be simply explained by evolutionary reasons, like for instance, how a child is afraid of strangers because they are not certain if that person is going to harm them in any way or if that person is going to protect them. So what impact do we get here? Firstly, by centering the narrative in the movement, they push back on the primary attack on them by eliminating the mutual exclusivity narrative of religion and LGBT leads to more acceptance. Therefore, there will be a safer environment for the LGBT people, fulfilling the whole goal of the movement, right? And also, not only for LGBT people in general, but especially for those most disadvantaged by their community, helping the most in need falls principally in the line with mission of the community, right? But before I move on to our next argument, I'm going to take a point.
You are running away from your burden aside proposition in this debate. You can't say the LGBT movement is neutral towards religion on your side. The LGBTQ movement has to support a certain interpretation of religion on your side of the house.
Look, we think that what we characterize in our framing is that currently this exists because of this anti-religion narrative, right? That someone who is gay must be a sinner according to that side. This is the principal clash in this debate that we are basically characterizing how we are getting rid of that, right? But now to our second argument, or how we get more LGBT friendly policies and how we get more discussion and therefore recognition by the church. So this is directly coming from the first argument, right? Because as we get less violence and polarization, the perception of the movement is going to shift, right? Because the goal again is acceptance and equal rights for all. And when this centering happens that we give you, by the analysis of the first argument, the people are going to change their mind. And why is legislative change more likely to happen on our side of the house? Firstly, because conservative legislators have to cater to the voter base. This includes a lot of religious people. And conservative policies and pushes on policies have to embrace religion and the interpretation of religion that their voters subscribe to. So in the status quo, they push mutual exclusivity of religion, not taken, and LGBT because that is the belief that dominates their voters, right? But by centering this topic, essentially what is going to happen is that they engage the conservative religious voter base, their perception is going to change, and policymakers will have no other choice but to follow it. We get more discussion and willingness to engage on LGBT topics as a whole. So what impact do we get here? Firstly, if more social acceptance comes from religious voters, the parties will have less incentive to sabotage pro-LGBT policies, like for instance, gay marriage, gender affirmative care, etc. So basically, we're getting equal rights for all as these conservative policies and politicians have to cater to their voters. But secondly, on vulnerable stakeholders like children. So religious parents now in the status quo just send their kids, for instance, to church to cure their sexuality, right? And this happens in the status quo because there's a lack of understanding around the topic, right? They have a lack of empathy for these people because they don't know what they feel like, and they make them feel guilty. And literally, small children who feel gender dysphoria or discover their sexual identity at a younger age are made to feel guilty about themselves. And this is fundamentally wrong because they have no control over this, right? This is proven. And they have severe impacts on their mental health. They have lower self-esteem. They're more likely to not become a well-functioning in adult life. And because they have been told that something is wrong with them. No wonder that in the status quo, the suicide rates are this high. And this has to change because in the status quo, lives are ruined and ended based on this immensely flawed perception. So the impact here is that we get more inclusion for the community where they can function properly, they can work without being discriminated against, they can get married, they can adopt kids and have their own family, go to church and practice their religion without other people bashing on them. Never been project to propose.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon Leader of Opposition to start a case for the side of opposition. Here.
Hi, can everybody see and hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Just as a reminder, once again, my pronouns are she, her, and I take POIs in the chat. Two things on opposition's stance in this debate. The first is that Prop needs to defend reinterpreting religion as the center of the LGBTQ plus movement. The movement as a whole is large and composed of individuals who do individual things in their private time. Proposition cannot simply support having gay preachers talk about rights in their own church or private discussion groups between closeted Christians. They need to support reinterpreting religion as being the center of public attention in the movement and the center of the LGBTQ plus narrative. Prop needs to prove that religion needs to be one of the most important things in the movement. That is their burden in this debate. Prop is already way behind because they're first told you that they're only going to support being neutral, and that is way out of the spirit of today's motion, given that they need to support religion as the center of this movement. Secondly, the center of the LGBTQ plus movement right now is pride, and that's exactly what opposition supports. The big issues supported by the movement are things like body positivity, sexual freedom, and free expression. This pride movement manifests itself in activities like colorful parades, drag racing, supporting Beyonce, things of that nature. We can support members individually taking stances on religion on our side. We don't think the movement as a whole, however, should take a stance on religion. We don't think that the LGBTQ plus movement must completely oppose religion on our side, given that there's religious members of the movement too who are very active within LGBTQ plus advocacy. If Prop proves that the two have an antagonistic relationship right now, we support neutralizing that relationship as well. Given that, two pieces of rebuttal. The first is that proposition needs to support the LGBTQ plus movement actively reinterpreting religion. If you reinterpret religion, say something like Jesus loves you even if you are gay, then you are actively taking a stance on that religion. You are not remaining neutral on it. Therefore, by the very nature of the motion, in the action of reinterpreting religion, you must already take a stance on what religion means. It's also pretty disingenuous to reinterpret a religion whose values you do not even align with, given that you are making such a big change towards Christian canon. You presumably have to be a Christian yourself as well. Secondly, proposition's soft case is probably not in the spirit of the motion, but even if it is, it's such an unimpactful case. Taking no stance on religion at all is not going to make religious individuals like bishops and the Pope, according to their impact, support the movement all of a sudden. They won't support this movement that used to hate them, that now is just neutral towards them. You need to change the minds of so many conservatives who believe that you are a movement of sinners in order to change all of these important people. Even if the LGBTQ movement is currently anti-religion, religious gay people can separate different social circles and different parts of their identity. You can go to church on Sunday and then go to Pride Parade some other day. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
So you're misunderstanding our case. We tell you how we're not taking a stance on whether religion is good or bad, but we're breaking the gate of like telling that religion has to conflict with like your sexual identity response.
If that's your stance, you can cross the aisle right now and take a seat on our side of the house, right? Because that's exactly what religious movements look like in the status quo. They have no active stance. They just don't say anything on it. Argument one on the authenticity of the LGBTQ plus movement. The pride at the center of the movement is mutually exclusive to centering religious reinterpretation. Every major religion promotes family values and thus are often sexually restrictive. They promote things like sexual abstinence until marriage, the value of the nuclear family, marriage being an absolute good, the sanctity of childhood. There's therefore a trade-off between aligning yourself with religion and upholding the current movements of the current values of the pride movement. Even in the gay positive set.
You're here.
Even in the gay positive sects of current religions, such as the Metropolitan Community Church in LA, gay rights are integrated into religious family values, promoting the nuclear gay parent family and sexual abstinence amongst gay partners. This sect is fine, but applying the values of the sect to the movement as a whole publicly means sacrificing the sexual freedom aspects of the movement that currently exist. If you reinterpret religion, you must do so under the assumption that the larger values of religion are good. The further you stray away from this fundamental aspect of religion, the weaker prop case becomes, because at that point, you can no longer co-opt religious people into your movement. The impact of this is threefold. The first is that you sacrifice the authenticity of the movement. Every single thing the gay movement wants to support, that individual members want to do, has to be checked against the millions of pages of text written under all of the major world religions that currently exist. Every new activity being done will need to be checked for whether or not it can align with a new religious compliance of the movement. For example, it It is unclear whether the LGBTQ movement can uncontentiously support surrogacies and IVFs for gay couples on prop anymore without knowing whether or not they're able to justify it religiously through one line of text in the Quran and one line of text in the Bible and one line of text in the Torah and all of these religious texts that exist. The second impact is on the fracturing of the movement. A lot of people in the LGBTQ movement are anti-religion for a variety of reasons. Some are liberals who dislike the way conservatives have infiltrated institutional religion. Others come from religious communities and face oppression in them. This will create fracturing within the movement as those individuals become alienated from the new center. Unlike beautiful colors and fun musical events, religion is one of the most controversial issues in the world. This translates to less political support for LGBTQ plus candidates and legislation and less cohesion in the movement as a whole. Not having an explicit stance on our side does not alienate the religious members because they're able to separately discover their religious identities. But taking a stance on prop in favor of religion is a stance against certain members. The third thing is losing the potential for intersectionality. The trend in the status quo is that all the movements are pivoting towards sexual freedom. Feminism supports sexual freedom and women reclaiming their sexuality. The Black Pride movement is recentering around sexual freedom and reinterpreting Black culture as being freeing instead of degenerate. The LGBTQ movement stands at the center of this intersectionality by emphasizing sexual freedom, where feminist icons like Beyonce has a new song called Break My Soul that samples the drag queen Big Freedia. This is good because there is strength in numbers. LGBTQ people will always be a minority, but they are no longer one when combined with all the other social movements. Sexual freedom is their common ground and prop takes that away. This weighs up against the marginal increase in support from religious communities on prop because the sudden recentering of religion on prop goes against centuries of homophobia, whereas on op it's fairly easy to get other oppressed individuals to become allies when they can also relate to the trauma of the oppressed. Second argument, therefore, on trauma. This argument is about LGBTQ individuals born in heavily conservative societies. Their parents and communities indoctrinated them into believing they were sinful. They might have been sent to conversion therapy. These people are few in number, but given their suffering, high impact in this debate. Coming out of the closet was probably the hardest experience in their lives. There's a reason why LGBTQ movements from the most conservative communities choose to completely change their identities after coming out. They quit their jobs, they find new friend groups, they move to New York City, they completely leave their churches. The LGBTQ plus movement on our side is a safe space and a source of catharsis for these people. It is able to act as this type of space because the movement has a completely unique culture that is the antithesis of church culture, where people are encouraged to be themselves, to do whatever they want, rather than value things like purity and chastity. People from the oppressive backgrounds are therefore able to find themselves and recover from their trauma through the movement exactly for that reason, because it helps them forget about their old lives for long enough to build new ones. This changes on prop, where the LGBTQ movement forces these individuals to relive that trauma every single day of their lives. They inevitably have to co-opt and center religious procedures and individuals in the movement in order to have authority and ethos when reinterpreting values. This looks like having gay preachers talk about the Bible, giving sermons which per Christian tradition will inevitably include the hints and stories from possibly traumatic childhoods. That's why this argument matters, because even if you buy proposition case that is simply going to be part of the movement, so long as it is part of the movement, that trauma is all relived. So for all of these reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
I would like to thank Leader of Opposition for that fine speech and would like to call upon Deputy Prime Minister to continue with the case for the side of proposition. Here.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, again, she, her pronouns, verbal POIs, please. Panel, what is this motion about? We think that this motion is not fundamentally about the pride, the movement itself fully becoming a religious movement, right? We think what this motion is fundamentally about is what we tell you in first. We tell you that centering these ideas, it looks like centering specific religious ideas that the movement can indeed agree with. That's the point of the reinterpretation of religion, right? We think that if you keep a vast, all of the religious values, that doesn't mesh with the motion well, precisely because the motion is about reinterpretation of religion by these groups, right? We tell you what this looks like on our side of the house in first, right? We tell you that this looks like, for instance, the movement pushing back on ideas that being gay is something that is sinful. It also looks like like them having different interpretations of like certain scriptures, right? We also tell you that this looks like embracing religious concepts that are very much in line with the movement, like for instance, saying that like you should love your neighbor, etc. You should accept other people, right? We think what this fundamentally means is that no, this is not our case being neutral to religion. It is not, because it clearly has an opinion on religion. It highlights how certain religious concepts do indeed have value. We think what this is what this motion is fundamentally about, right? So I'll do three things in this speech. Firstly, rebuttal, secondly, rebuilding, and then thirdly, moving on to an argument on intersectionality, right? So the main argument they give you that the pride and this is something that is mutually exclusive, right? We think that, like, first off, due to all of the different movements that they talk about, like for instance, the feminist movement or other kinds of movements that also generally support the LGBTQIA plus movement. We think what this means is that these individuals are not going to be locked out of things like not having sexual freedom, right? We think that highlighting specific aspects of the church for the specific cause of making it more palatable to religious individuals, which is what our case is based on. We think something like this is not necessarily going to push back on or directly, no thank you, or like go against fully like sexual freedom and those kinds of concepts. And even if it does, these individuals are still going to be able to access those kinds of concepts in general and get acceptance from other kinds of communities, right? We think furthermore, this doesn't exclude the religious people that we want to win on our side of the house. We're not like having this motion to specifically get the most fundamentalist individuals, right? What we want is to like create a common ground with the movement and with these groups. We think that what this again looks like is pushing that certain ideas of religion are very much good. Certain ideas are things that can be supported by the movement. Also note that it's becoming more widespread that these ideas like having no sexual freedom, etc., are things that are no longer mutually are no longer something that is directly tied to religion, right? We see that in the status quo there are more and more religious individuals who are also joining all kinds of movements, right, supporting these kinds of ideas, or at least not opposing them openly, right? What this means is that by like going towards these values and maybe, yes, preaching some sort of family values on our side of the house, saying that, yes, we support like things like settling down into a family, etc. We think that is like specifically enough not to alienate these individuals, right? We think furthermore, this is not likely to fracture the movement. Why is this so? We think that first, like the reinterpretation of the religion will not necessarily support for it nor blind the movement, right? We think members of the community will still and should stand up to discrimination and inequality and oppression wherever they come, like whenever it comes from things like religious people, right? We think furthermore, this looks like this means that this is like an open and average non-fundamentalist religious people are still likely to support the movement, right? We think that the fundamental concepts of the movement, which is that like these individuals should be able to live how they want, are something that are still likely to draw people in, right? We think that in the status quo even, there are some different segments, there are different segments of the movement. So even if you buy this argument, we think that like there's not going to be a lot more fragmentation than in the status quo. There are still things like some gay people not supporting trans people, etc., right? We don't think that the movement is like completely unified in the status quo because it doesn't have one uniform narrative, right? So moving on, we think that no, thank you. We think that we still have potential for intersectionality, because note that they say that the only thing that like intersectionality is based on is like this support for sexual freedom. We don't think that this is true. We think that in general, a lot of these movements are based on the idea of acceptance and equality, right? That's the fundamental tenet of all of these movements, not sexual freedom. We see this is and this is why, like, for instance, there are like different like conservative individuals who are like very, very religious supporting the feminist movement, right? We think that what this means is that we're still likely to get this kind of intersectionality with the support of the common goal of having more equality and less discrimination, right? We don't think that sexual freedom is what is like the central tenet of these movements. Now let's talk about trauma, and I'll directly respond to this in our point of intersectionality, but I'll move on to a POI before that.
How do you gain enough ethos in the religious communities to impactfully reinterpret the Bible if your movement is still neutral and half the people in your movement publicly hate religion?
our movement is not neutral. We tell you in our framing, and we tell you in the beginning of this speech, that what happens on our side of the house is that we have a very direct support for religion as a concept, for people believing in things. We also tell you that we have a direct support for very specific religious concepts. This is not neutrality, right? Furthermore, we think that this in itself lets individuals focus on common ground between this movement and religious values, which means that religious individuals are no longer getting pushback from the movement and getting hatred from the movement, from the main narrative of the movement, even if there are some throwaway individuals who might not be religious, right? What this means is that we get far more support from religious individuals. Now, moving on to intersectionality, right? As the other side points out, there is overlap between religious individuals and like the LGBTQIA plus community, right? In the status quo, because the LGBT movement has put on at least an implicit anti-religious stance by like openly opposing religion, right? We think on our side, on the other side, there are a lot of religious leaders who are still somewhat against the LGBT movement, right? We think that this duality, the people are most ignored, are religious members of the LGBTQ community, right? We think that there are a lot of people who still believe in religion. We think that this happens regardless of like their family like treating them not that well, right? We think that they can still embrace the like abstract concept of religion, even if their religious families were bad. Right? We think that this is what the movement highlights, because on your side of the house, you're literally pushing the narrative that like the religion is the direct cause for the suffering of gay people through things like different like church camps or whatever, trying to change their sexuality, right? We push back on this narrative. We say that there can be like a coexistence between the religious movement and religious people and the LGBTQIA plus movement, right? So what happens on our side of the house is, one, we lessen anti-religious sentiment in the LGBTQ community. These individuals can still be mad at their abusive families. This is not something that is re-traumatizing them. Secondly, we think it can serve as a place of acceptance for people most torn by their identities, who are perceived as which they perceive as contradicting. And we also stop people from being torn away from their religious families in cases where they are not abusive. Thank you.
I would like to thank Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech, and would like to call upon Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue with the case for the side of opposition. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible and clear?
Yes, you are.
Right off the bat, it's important to point out that proposition's stance is incredibly unclear and within a double bind, because they simply have too passive a stance to get legitimate impacts. If they want to support having a very neutral ideology where everything is very passive and we only talk about things that are uncontroversial, you never get enough support to get any religious individual to care. So for example, if you say like, loving your family is a good thing, that's not a high enough bar to get religious activists to be on board with LGBTQ movements and care in general. That leads to very, very little impacting. But then they say, no, well, we're going to support a lot of ideas. If you actually want to support enough ideas to get religious individuals to opt in on a large scale into the LGBTQ movement, that also requires you to concede a lot of things that the LGBTQ movement is fundamentally against. That is against the purpose of the LGBTQ movement, because many of the other ideologies that are crucially important are going to be neglected if you support religion as a whole, and that leads to many other impacts. Therefore, I think in general, their impacts are already extremely unclear. There's two big questions in this debate. One on religious backlash and how religious groups will react, and secondly, on the obligations of the LGBTQ groups. One, on religious backlash, three things. First, on the prop mechanization, they simply assert that on their side, LGBTQ groups will accept religion and this will solve all the problems. Their fiat only goes to the extent of reinterpretation, which means often like that looks like things like, for example, looking at the Bible, looking at parts of it and saying this can be interpreted to say that LGBTQ is being supported. Reinterpretation does not mean you can fiat mass love and mass support. So already the core mechanism, which that everyone in the LGBTQ movement will suddenly support and praise religion, is one that is already untrue. We tell you it's more likely going to look like things like reinterpreting the Bible and negotiating what the religion actually thinks about LGBTQ groups. That already means that a core mechanism is off in this debate and it's a wrong characterization. But furthermore, this also impacts things like the fracturing of LGBTQ movements, because we told you, if you do actually try to accept religion as a whole, many individuals disagree. Because if you look at the status quo, there is a large degree of negative sentiment within LGBTQ groups against religion. So for that reason, on their side, there will be a lot of fracturing. We heard no response to this entire argumentation. So on their side, LGBTQ groups are much weaker. That's bad, because when it comes to things like voting power and uniform policies that we want to support that get changed for everyone, you get less of that when you fracture the movement as a whole. That's already bad. So that's already important to point out, because that means the characterization of what reinterpretation look like is already extremely off. The third speaker needs to address this. Secondly, how will religious groups respond? And we're going to take them at their best and say reinterpretation just means to some degree that, you just accept religion, right? Which is already, as we pointed out, not the point of this debate. There's a gaping hole in the proposition case. They assert that religious groups simply will just accept the entire LGBT group at the point when you buy into religion, but they never actually prove this. Like, one, just because the LGBTQ group says we like parts of religion, why is it suddenly true that religious individuals will buy into the LGBTQ movement? Because as we characterized to you, within religious groups, there is some sentiment against LGBTQ ideas, especially for more devout individuals, because people interpret the Bible in ways that say things like, for example, it's wrong to be LGBTQ, and many people who are religious buy into the ideology. So even if this entire social movement buys into religion, why is it suddenly that every religious individual will care and buy into the LGBTQ movement and vote for them? That's a mechanization never proven. So their entire upshot of, then you get this massive voting base never actually legitimizes on their side. But secondly, as we told you, a more realistic view of this debate means you do have to reinterpret parts of religion, right? So people in LGBT groups are likely to challenge certain ideologies that are given by religious bodies. Otherwise you have a lot of compromises, right? So for that reason, that also leads to further backlash. This already means their entire impacting, and the only link to get to their impacting, which is that mass buy-in from religious groups occur, is unlikely to happen in the very first place, and they never prove it. They just assert it. But furthermore, we're going to take them to even higher ground, right? Why is that religious backlash likely to occur? And this is like a larger impact, because we tell you the very process of reinterpretation leads to backlash. Because what happens on their side in most cases, that you look at the Bible and you say, we disagree with how you perceive LGBT groups. We think the Bible says this, and for example, look at this passage. We think that process in and of itself, especially when done by LGBT movements and individuals who are not religious experts, is specifically bad, because that is a process that, in general, is seen as very sacred by individuals who care about religion, right? Because interpreting the book of a very religious book, like the Bible, for example, is supposed to be done by individuals who are in high places of religious authority. So when individual movements try to co-opt that and interpret on an individual level basis and implement those ideologies within their social movements, we think that leads to a lot of religious backlash, because that's seen as something that's very important, and therefore it looks like they're disagreeing with their religion. That's why religious backlash is actually likely on their side, so you get even less support from religious groups. They need to respond to this argumentation. Why is this so important? Because it speeds out all their impacting at an even higher ground, right? Because it proves that politicians, for example, have an incentive on their side to take more extreme stances against LGBT groups when you're, for example, a Republican politician, because now the general sentiment of Republicans and individuals who tend to be more religious tend to be against these movements. That takes out the best case impact. Also, all the argumentation I gave you about why they don't prove religious backlash also shows why even in the very best case, they don't prove mass buy-in. So they're only impacting the first feature, is that we get more voting power, doesn't actually happen. We're also going to introduce a new impact here. This is new substantive, because we think in the status quo, if you want to get your LGBTQ ideas into developing countries, which often have more extreme religions, you need to take a more passive stance. On their side, when you try to reinterpret actively and you tell these countries, well, we are telling you this, right? We are interpreting religion. This is what we believe is true. That is a world going to lead to mass backlash in those areas. That's specifically bad, because that means infiltration of LGBTQ ideologies and acceptance never enter those regions that are extremely religious in places, for example, like Saudi Arabia. So you never get that degree of implementation on their side of the house, because you take too extreme of a stance. That's a big problem. So we proved to you how religious backlash is likely to occur, and therefore all their impacts of buy-in don't occur. What did we tell you then? That's the second question. What are the obligations of an LGBTQ group? One, on religious individuals. Prob runs an argument in the first speech about children and gender dysphoria, but did absolutely no work to link this to religion or anything, right? So already that entire stakeholder is quite irrelevant, because they don't link it to the debate. We also flip this, because we tell you that movement on our side is more accepting, right? Because our core ideology is saying pride is important. On their side, the core emphasis is talking about religion. So on a comparative on our side, these demographics are better off. But what do we tell you? We give you a very important argument on why we prevent trauma. Steph gives you this entire argument, and the only response you heard to it is essentially saying that on their side, it's going to be better, right? And the only mechanization is that, religious groups once again buy in and are accepting. We already proved to her that's unlikely to happen, but the biggest difference on our side is that you get to opt in. Because even in their best case, if religious groups do buy into your religion and are very happy about it, that doesn't mean this individual doesn't have the trauma go away. But on our side, you get a safe space. If you go into an LGBTQ rally, there is no talking religion in most cases. And in general, you have an accepting environment to be yourself and be proud of who you are. On their side, when you go to LGBTQ rallies, religion is the center of what is being talked about. It'll be constantly discussed. So for that reason, you never get a safe space and environment to be yourself and escape your trauma of religion. That's a massive impact that affects a lot of people. We never heard a proper response. Secondly, what are the goals of the movement? This takes the entire proposition case at their very, very best, because we're going to assume everything they say can happen. Let's say they get, a little bit more religious buy-in. Why is our side still better? Because crucially, we think the purpose of the movement is to cater to the most people. And there are many other issues that affect a lot more individuals than religion. Because even if religious people buy in and religious people feel a little bit better on our side, that's a relatively small demographic of the entire movement. We think other issues, like for example, getting legislative change, things like for example, widespread fighting against discrimination, affect much more individuals, and pride therefore should be the focus. The reason this is crucial is because one, if we just weigh, on our side, everyone benefits from those things, right? So even if you're a religious individual in an LGBTQ movement, you benefit from, for example, less discrimination. On their side, only religious groups buy in, and in general, there's like a lesser impact. But furthermore, on our side, there's also less fracturing because you cater to much more people. On their side, there's a religious focus. Many groups likely fracture away because they don't buy in to the general idea and don't agree with this being the central idea of a movement. That fracturing means less political power and less change. So on our side, we cater to the most important issue, and we actually benefit a much larger group of people. We think that's crucial because the goal of social movement is to cater to a large group of people to get large-scale social change. On their side, you cater to a small group of people and make that the entire center of the movement. We think that's fundamentally wrong to get change. We never hear a response to this, so we beat them at their best extremely clearly. For all these reasons, very, very proud to oppose.
I would like to thank Deputy Leader of Opposition for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon Proposition Whip to conclude substantive part of this debate for the side of Proposition. Hear, hear.
Okay, just to confirm, am I audible and visible like this?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I would like POIs verbally because everyone should be looking at the chat. And my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Panel on the side of opposition already lost this debate when they failed to actually acknowledge what we are debating about, right? In this speech, I will firstly clear up the proposition burden and what their actual characterization of the debate was. Secondly, tell you about why we get more acceptance for the LGBTQ movement. And thirdly, on who is able to fulfill the obligation of the movement more, which is to get actual change to the most amount of people through legislative change. So on to what we are not have to prove in this debate. Firstly, we do not have to prove full buy-in from the whole of the LGBTQ community and the whole of the religious community, right? We are not debating that. What we have to prove and what we have been proving through this debate is that we are going to destroy the narrative of mutual exclusivity of either you are religious or you are part of the LGBTQ community. That is the only thing that we have to defend, and the side of opposition failed to engage with that. Second of all, then we are not catering to religious people. We are not going to make the LGBTQ plus movement a religious movement. We are not talking about how in every single rally there's not going to be any kind of pride rallies anymore because we are just going to talk about religion. This is clearly a strong enough argument. What we are telling you is that we are going to debate as the public agenda, right? The crucial difference of what they are debating is that we are going to still keep the internal agenda of the movement. That means that we are still going to have pride parade. That means that we are still going to promote, no thank you, equality and acceptance and be yourself inside of the movement. But the public agenda is directly targeted to the public, to the people who are already not bought into the movement. That is what we are going to change on outside of the house. So when they tell you that religious movements are going to become the LGBTQ movement, and the religious people and the people of the LGBTQ movement are not going to feel safe inside of the movement because they are just constantly being pushed to talk about religion, is clearly a straw man. We are not going to do that in this debate. So second of all, in the status quo, already we have established that there is this narrative, the mutual exclusivity, right? Either you're religious or you're part of the movement. This is especially acknowledged by the side of opposition as well. What we are doing in this debate, by especially catering to the people in the public agenda that they are part of the religious movement, that they have to acknowledge that that is not mutually exclusive. The reinterpretation that we are doing is not necessarily in the form of pointing at the Bible, and this is what you see wrong, is adapting ideologies, adapting basic ideas inside of that religious text and interpreting it in a way that is going to be able to not destroy this mutual exclusivity agenda. No, thank you. That means that if the Bible contains like a phrase that like promotes like being friendly with your neighbors, we are going to co-opt that into the like narrative that is targeting the religious people coming from the LGBTQ public agenda and saying that, oh, hey, you're actually not mutually exclusive. You're not saying that you're interpreting the whole Bible like wrong. You're saying that the interpretation that you give is not like mutually exclusive and you can be still part of both communities, right? We have given you 2 layers of like characterization on what the actual view of the religious groups are, right? They are against religion because they are against the LGBTQ movement because they believe that this is a sin. They believe that this is something that is inherently against their kind of agenda. At a point at which the LGBTQ community is able to co-opt this kind of framing and is able to like actively show that indeed their existence is not a sin, they are much more likely to actually be able to co-opt these kind of religious views and destroy the mutual exclusivity narrative on that of the house. Second of all, then we tell you how the LGBTQ movement is directly framed and seen as some kind of, which is like the antichrist, basically, who's opposing the religious movement, who is actively like committing sins. This was also acknowledged by the side of opposition, and this is very harmful because at the point at which they are framed to being like very anti-religious, even though most of the members of the LGBT community are not directly opposing religion, they're just not accepted by religious people. That is why they are shown as some kind of like anti-religious. They're not going to be able to get acceptance on that side of the house as long as this mutual exclusivity framework works on that side of the house. So that is what we are destroying uniquely in this debate. They have never responded to this framework, so therefore they already lose on that. So first, who is able to create more acceptance. As I've already mentioned, that at the point at which they are not able to show by this mutual exclusivity narrative is going to change, they're not going to be able to change anything about the situation of the LGBTQ community, right? We tell you in the very framing of our first speech that the major attack, the primary attack that comes to LGBTQ people is coming from the religious community on the basis that it's against their religion, right? So the main like pushback on the LGBTQ community is not because of their existence, not because of what they are doing. It is because they believe that it's against the religion because it's mutually exclusive. That is what you are uniquely destroying. Firstly, we believe that they have given you 3 main pushbacks on this. Firstly, that the LGBTQ movement is not going to like embrace this, right? They're already strawmanning our case. No, thank you. They are already strawmanning our case when they're telling you that, oh, this is going to be a religious movement. They are not going to feel safe. They are not going to be able to like feel equal. Again, this is only the public agenda that we are pushing outside of the community, and we are still going to be able to co-opt the equality because we are only going to co-opt the sentences and the frameworks from the religion that is directly not clashing with the active agenda of the LGBTQ community. Secondly, they tell you that this is going to be like major fracturing because of the anti-religion sentiment. We tell you that this anti-religion sentiment only exists in the status quo, thank you, in the movement because of the like anti-LGBTQ sentiment coming from the religious movements. So at the point at which you are going to be able to destroy this kind of sentiment, this is not going to be true on the other house because we are only going to support those kind of ideas which is not contradicting the core ideas of the LGBTQ movement. So the fracturing is not going to be like as severe as they tell you. But we tell you that in the second speech, that even if that would be the case, the LGBTQ movement is already some kind of fracture, right? There's already some kind of segments even on that side of the house. So you have clearly not mechanized why that would be some significant impact on that side of the house. Thirdly, they tell you that, oh, the religious groups are going to not respond well. Again, this is come back to the mutual exclusivity narrative, which they failed to address, right? At the point at which we take out the perception of the LGBTQ movement of being the antichrist because they are directly going against religion, they are directly saying that religion is bad, they are not interpreting a religion as a way that is applying to them, they are going to be taking out this like very backlashy response from the religious groups on that side of the house. So we have managed to prove to you that we are going to be able to get more acceptance on our side of the house at the point at which we destroy this argument. We secondly tell you that intersectionality is going to be, is going to be happening significantly more on our side of the house because again, the basis of intersectionality is the belief in equality, which we are going to co-opt on our side of the house. At the point at which we do so, all of the social movements that they have on that side of the house are going to be still like intertwined with the LGBTQ community. So they're not going to lose any kind of political capital on us of the house. But what we uniquely get is the support from some religious communities who are also going to be subscribing to the equality narrative. So again, intersectionality is going to be significantly more dominant on us of the house. Then the response about developing countries and how this like extreme religious condition is not going to have like any kind of backlash. No, after this point. So what we tell you is that at the point at which you live in an extreme religious community, you're probably not going to say that, oh, the whole way that you have interpreted religion is wrong. You're going to be gradually moving on forward and gradually proving to these people that the mutually exclusive narrative does not exist. And we tell you that especially in these countries, it is very important that these movements co-opt the framing of the religion. And especially in these countries, if they do not do so, they are going to be severely discriminated against on that side of the house. There is going to be no change if they do not support this kind of like religious co-opting. And therefore, again, on their point about developing countries, we are clearly better. Before moving on, I will take a POI.
If gaining Christian support is as simple as co-opting Christian values, why can't the movement just involve Christians by saying they support love in general?
What we believe is that precisely what you are saying. No. So what I explained already in the framing of my speech is that because there's the perception that they are not, because of the perception that they are inherently against religion, right? They cannot just say that we are like supporting love in general. They have to say that somehow they're co-opting the values of religion. At the point at which your movement is not saying that we are supporting like love, you are supporting love, we are somehow co-opted and intertwined, you're not going to get that change. It's uniquely happening on us. But secondly, about legislation. The second speaker of the opposition tells you that there is the obligation of the movement to help benefit as much people as possible. We tell you that this is true, and we uniquely agree with that. And what happening is that the way that you establish this kind of like obligation to benefit as much people as possible is by legislative change. We tell you in our first speech that in this current status quo, because there is such kind of divide between the religious community and the LGBTQ community, the religious community, most precisely the right wing and the conservative ideologies, are directly sabotaging the pushing of any kind of ideas coming from the left and coming from the LGBTQ community. They are not going to be able to combat that as long as they do not accept this kind of communities, as long as they do not try to target the religious community and co-opt them into some level of support on the LGBTQ community. What we get is more support for this kind of, for the movement, and therefore more discussion on the agenda, and not active sabotage by the other side of the house that is going to happen on that side. So on the obligation of movement, we are clearly better because we are still keeping the core values of the LGBT community, and we are managing to co-opt some level of religious support, and therefore create more discussion and obligation of the movement to push some kind of places and get more gay rights. So therefore, we are very proud to propose. Thank you.
I would like to thank Proposition Whip for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon Opposition Whip to conclude substantive part of this debate. Hear, hear.
Hello, can you see me and can you hear me, and may I begin?
Yep.
Okay, wait 1 second. I want to clarify two things at the top of the speech. One, this debate is not about getting rid of mutual exclusivity between religious beliefs and LGBTQ beliefs. The motion requires proposition to defend more than that. It requires a proposition to get the LGBTQ movement to center reinterpreting religions within the movement. This isn't the same thing as getting rid of mutual exclusivity. Why? Because on our side of the house, you can still say we support intersectionality, right? That you can be a gay Christian, you can be a Black Christian, you can be a woman who is a member of the LGBTQ movement. We can do this under the capacity that we don't take a stance on religion in general, right? Like we accept you whether or not you're religious. You don't need to reinterpret religion in order to accept intersectionality. Their burden is a lot bigger because their burden requires the movement to go into religious authority and tell them how to properly interpret religion in a more pro-LGBTQ way. They're running away from this burden in this debate. But second, even if you believe that you don't run away from their burden, their incredibly soft case poses a trade-off with all of their impacts. We point this out to you in second, there's no response. The trade-off is this. It's that if they only want to highlight very few areas of similarity between the LGBTQ movement and the religious movement, then you don't get much religious buy-in, right? Because if the only thing they highlight is, oh, we both say love thy neighbor, then like no religious person is just going to buy into your movement if you only highlight very few areas of similarity. That's a crucial trade-off. But third thing I want to know at the top is that there's just a lack of illustration, right? It is still unclear as to this at this point in this debate, exactly how they want to reinterpret religion, right? Do they want religious officials to do it? Do they want members of the activists to do it? No idea from them, no illustration. As a result, none of their mechanisms make much sense. Three clashes. First, on the authenticity of the LGBTQ movement. Second, on support for the LGBTQ movement. Third, on religious individuals within the LGBTQ movement. First, on the authenticity of the movement. The authenticity of the movement is important because the movement is no more than the sum of its parts. For the LGBTQ movement to be valuable, it needs to authentically represent the views of its members. We explained to you in the top of our case that reinterpreting religion means aligning with those values. Thus, you restrict to what your movement can support. Because in order for the LGBTQ movement to support something now on their house, they need to find some support of that thing in religious texts, right? Sure, you might find support of like gay marriage, but you might not find support in virtual fertilization, which is crucial for gay couples in order to have a kid of their own, right? Therefore, they severely restrict what the movement can support if the movement has an obligation to align with religious texts. What were their responses? Their first response is no, but we can do this softly, right? We only need to highlight the areas of similarity, like loving thy neighbor. We don't need to compromise on other values. Two responses to their response. One, there's a signaling effect, right? Because religious interpretation isn't a secular, rational discussion of values. It's an argument from authority, right? It It isn't who is right, it's who is closer to the Bible or who is closer to the Quran. Therefore, when the LGBTQ movement supports engaging itself in reinterpretation, the prerequisite to reinterpretation is the idea that you believe that the Bible is a source of authority, because you cannot have religious arguments about who is the right interpretation unless you believe that the Bible is a source of authority. Therefore, if you believe that the Bible is a source of authority, then you just run into a lot of contradictions, right? Because if you say the Bible is a source of authority here, therefore that's why you can't. That is why we can get gay marriage. Then you also have to defend why you can get IVF, even though IVF isn't explicitly said in the Bible. But second, if their case is about highlighting similarity, I don't know why you need to reinterpret religion in order to highlight similarity. You can highlight similarity without reinterpreting religion. Highlighting similarity is saying, look, I support loving thy neighbor. You support loving thy neighbor too. So we both support loving thy neighbor. That's what highlighting similarity is. Reinterpreting religion is your interpretation of religion is wrong. This is how you correctly reinterpret religion. So if their quabble is about similarity, you can probably still find some similarity on our side of the house. The second response is, oh, but body positivity and other things like sexual liberty is not fundamental to the movement. Therefore, the only thing that's fundamental to the movement is about loving everyone. And religion also says you should love everyone. No, body positivity is central to the movement. Why? Because it's a prerequisite of loving who you want to love, right? Sexual liberation means you can marry who you want. You can have sex with who you want. You can engage in romance with who you want. Not with the conservative notion of marriage. That is to say, one between a man and a woman and one in which you cannot have sex until you marry, right? So it is fundamental to the movement. Equality comes after that. Third, their third response is like, oh, but we can do it publicly to religious authorities. We don't have to change what happens within the movement. No. Publicity is how people engage with the movement. Public events like gay pride parades, public events like social media posts is how people engage with the movement. So you can't do it publicly, but not have it affect the movement internally. It doesn't make any sense. On our side, we give the LGBTQ movement what it wants at its roots, which is liberty, and that is what we provide when you do not have to constrain yourself to religious authority. Second question, let's talk about support for the LGBTQ movement. They say religious groups will support you. Understand that their argument is contingent on an unproven premise. They need to prove why religious authorities will accept your interpretation instead of responding to you in a violent way. Because their case is contingent on the LGBTQ movement saying, this is the right interpretation, and religious people saying, you know what, I was wrong before, you're right, your movement is right, I'll interpret it in the way you want me to interpret it. We think people are more likely to respond aggressively that can concede that the LGBTQ movement is right. There's a variety of reasons for why this is the case. One, they've been taught a certain interpretation of religion for their whole life. The priests and the popes have expertise in interpreting the Bible. A random LGBTQ activist has no expertise in reinterpreting the Bible. So they will believe their traditional pope over an LGBTQ activist every day. But two, the church doesn't want to tolerate a slippery slope, right? Because if they can see that their interpretation is wrong in this specific instance, it delegitimizes their power to exercise other interpretations in the future. Therefore, the upshot isn't the church will now support you. The upshot is the church will clamp down on you in more aggressive ways. Because in the status quo, you do have some level of more ambivalence within the church, right? Like Pope Francis in the status quo is relatively ambivalent about LGBT issues. He doesn't really try to talk about gay marriage. But on this house, you actively attack him. You attack the church. You tell the church your interpretation is wrong. You need to reinterpret it using my interpretation. That is when the church is more likely to clamp down on priests, for example, who might be somewhat tolerant of LGBTQ activism in the status quo. Contrast their impact to our impact. Our impact is that you lose the liberal coalition that the LGBTQ movement is currently built towards. In the status quo, the LGBTQ movement has a coalition with the feminist movement and other minority movements. All of these other movements also oppose religion because religion also restricts their autonomy. The feminist movement opposes religion because it goes against the right to an abortion, for example, which is fundamental to their movement. Therefore, when the LGBTQ movement betrays all their allies by saying, you know what, I will support religion by reinterpreting, by supporting
did speaker disappear for everyone else or froze? Okay, I paused the timer at 6:45. May the team members perhaps contact your teammate?
Hello, can you see me now?
You were
Can you see me?
breaking
Can you
off.
hear me?
Now we can, I think, but you were breaking off when firstly asked that question.
Oh, sorry. What was the last thing you heard from my speech, and what's my timestamp?
It's 6:45, so we have a minute and a half roughly. I think for me was the end of the comparison between the impacts about intersectionality.
Oh, the stuff about feminism, right? Is that what you
Yeah,
mentioned?
yeah. You finished that point.
Okay. Their response to this argument is that people in the movement hate religion in the status quo because the movement hates religion. No, they hate religion for their personal reasons. They believe that religion is the antithesis to the LGBTQ movement. They believe that religion is what caused them trauma in their previous life. Therefore, on their side of the house, they're likely to create fracturing both within the movement and within the broader liberal coalition. This is bigger than their impact because it's a problem of probability, right? Maybe you get religious people to support you on their side, but you probably don't, insofar as every other religious doctrine tells them to hate gay people. On our side of the house, you lose the certain support of the liberal coalition when you decide to betray them by saying, I will now be pro-religion, I'll teach them how to reform their religion instead of taking a stance that is anti-religion. Our impact is more probable than theirs. Third, let's talk about religious people within the LGBTQ movement. The first thing I want to say is what we told you at the top of 01, which is how much of their benefits actually has to do with the public nature of supporting religion or the public nature of reinterpreting religion. Because you can still have things like private discussion groups on our side of the house, right? Those are things that are not related to the debate. So the debate is about gay Christians accepting themselves. They can still accept themselves by private discussion groups by other gay Christians who have successfully converted. They need to defend publicity. What was our impact? Our impact was trauma, because what you eliminate for them is choice. When the movement on their house takes a reinterpreting religion stance, that is when everyone within the movement has to support that in reinterpreting religious stance. They can't support a wide variety of other things, such as being pro-religion or being anti-religion. On their house, you give religious people trauma. You prevent the escapism that currently exists in the status quo. And for them, the movement that was supposed to provide to them escapism is just a reminder of their old religious tendencies. For these reasons, we are very proud to oppose. Sorry about lagging out. Hopefully everything is clear.
No worries. I would like to thank Opposition Whip for that fine speech and would like to call upon Opposition Reply Speaker to sum up the upbench in this debate. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
The strategic mistake made by the proposition in this debate is to consistently try to use the redefinition and assertions of what reinterpreting means to try to win clashes and engage rather than actually engaging and weighing in this debate. And I think that already puts them at a massive disadvantage. Considering that, there's three big points of adjudication in this debate. One, let's talk about religious response and how these groups respond. Prop 1 proposed the idea that reinterpreting religion means that these groups will suddenly accept religion, and that leads to a bridge of inclusivity, etc. We pointed out very clearly right off the bat that is already not what talking about reinterpretation means. Centering reinterpretation means things like reinterpreting religious texts in certain ways that benefit the LGBTQ movement. It is unclear why they're able to assert in the proposition that it suddenly means mass acceptance or buy into religious groups. We pointed this out very clearly. We never heard a resolution. This already means that in general, it's unlikely to get any of their impacts, right? Because as you characterized in many LGBT groups, there is a general disliking of religion as a whole and seen as a negative thing. So it's unclear whether buy-in and the reinterpretation will be in a positive light. This was pointed out clearly. We never heard a pushback. But furthermore, we also say this also isn't fulfilling their burden, because if we buy their best case and all they want is talking about it's not mutually exclusive, we can also get that. You don't have to reinterpret religion or reinterpret religious text to say you can be religious and also a gay individual. That was also what we pointed out, especially clearly by Bowser. They need to respond to this somehow. This already points out that their impact is not really actualizing. But we also know the very best. You're very generous in this debate. We say that even if you do get buy-in from LGBTQ groups, religious groups will still backlash and not support you for two reasons that were unresponded to. One, we told you that link that, the link of the fact that LGBTQ groups support religion leads to religion supporting you reciprocally was never proven, right? So it's unclear religious groups will suddenly accept, especially when they have certain ideas that are often against LGBT groups. But furthermore, we also told you that reinterpreting specifically as a mechanism is seen as very sacred by religious groups that should only be done by religious authorities in their religion. So now when another movement tries to reinterpret and do things is seen as very, very important, that is likely to lead to mass backlash. That's an especially important link that was never responded to. So for these reasons, we're able to prove to you why these movements will receive a lot more backlash on our side. So all they're impacting on, buy-in from religious groups are unlikely. In fact, they get much worse on their side. This is particularly important in developing countries where we told you in order to get LGBTQ ideologies in those regions, you can't incite any backlash. That was especially important impacting that was never responded to. So we proved to you why their best case doesn't actually happen. Therefore, on their side, religions react in worse ways. Secondly, on vulnerable individuals, this argument on trauma was never properly responded to. And this is very important because it has a massive impact on these individuals. We told you these movements in the status quo are crucial safe space for individuals who were traumatized by religious groups and religious environments. On their side, you take that away when the fact that every time you go to a rally, every time you go to a topic, the center of discussion is still religion, and especially on their best case, if it's accepting religion, that's specifically traumatizing. We never heard a sufficient response. You need to buy these impacts on a very vulnerable group that's affected a great degree on their side. But furthermore, we also told you that catering to the LGBT group doesn't happen on their side. Because in many cases, if you want to buy into religious demographics and what they believe in, you have to make many concessions. That leads to a lot of fracturing and harms individuals within the movement because many people within LGBTQ movements have very strong ideas against religion and see it as a negative thing. That leads to fracturing, but also leads to mass harms to a group that the movement is supposed to protect. That also harms vulnerable individuals. That leads to the clash in terms of like very actualized impacts. 3, what are the goals of the movement? This argument took them their very best, but they never engaged with this. And that's a big problem for them. Because we told you that even in their best case, if you get some more buy-in, it is unclear why a couple more voters who are religious is going to be the tipping point for anything. So many of their impacts aren't very clear. What we tell you is very clear. The movement needs to cater to as many people as possible, especially its most vulnerable actors who are a member of the LGBTQ community. We get that on our side when we talk about things like pride that affect much more people. Religion is relatively niche. This is important because we told you when you get change on our side, it benefits everyone, right? So even if you're religious on our side within the group, you also benefit from things like, for example, less discrimination as a whole. That benefits both for people on our side and fulfills a purpose. But furthermore, we also told you we get less fracturing, and that's also crucially important to get political change. Movements need to actualize the most important policies, and since they have limited resources on their side, centering a policy and focusing on something that doesn't affect everyone is not a good strategy for the movement to take. On our side, more people are benefited and we get more change. For all these reasons, go for the opposition.
I would like to thank opposition reply speaker for that fine speech and would like to call upon proposition reply speaker to deliver the last speech of this debate. Hear, hear.
Panel, in the status quo, there is open opposition between religious individuals and the LGBTQ movement. Someone needs to take a first step to close this gap. When a religious person looks at the LGBTQ movement, all they see is a movement that dislikes them, a movement that is directly against them. We think on our side of the house, they can't just say that they support the same things. They need to actively stand and say, we support you, we support your ideology, we are not actively against you. We think this is a crucial difference that they need to engage with, right? We tell you what this specifically looks like, and yes, we do include reinterpreting certain ideas that are directly going against like being gay, being okay within like religious texts. We don't think that this is going to lead to extra backlash because, as we tell you, these individuals who are so against gay people, who believe that they are bad, we don't think that by the movement reinterpreting this specific thing, they're going to change their minds. What they're likely to respond to and likely to change is the minds of individuals who are not like actively opposed against being gay as a lifestyle. We see this a lot in countries like, for instance, Hungary, but they just think that the movement is against them. They think that their ideology is against them. This is what we actively respond to on our side of the house. So what do we tell you on more acceptance? Note that on their side of the house, they don't really change anything, right? We think that when it comes to things like the feminists or things like individuals within the movement, they're likely to still support the core tenets of the movement, which are things like equality, which are things like less discrimination. They're still likely to vote for individuals who support these ideas, specifically because these are core concepts that they're going to support objectively, no matter what the movement is saying. So the delta of this debate is purely religious people, right? We tell you two different layers of mechanization in first that they never directly respond to on why we're more likely to get support from religious individuals. Note, not necessarily religious leaders, but religious individuals, right? We tell you first that in the status quo, people view gay people as their enemy, and this is partly because of their tie to anti-religious ideas, right? We think when the movement starts talking about how they do not oppose religion, how they actively support it, apart from a few sentences like being gay is not okay, right? We think that what this means is we think that they support the fundamental parts of religion about love and support, that they directly support religion because it spreads these concepts. This is how animosity and opposition can be struck down on our side of the house. Op does nothing to this, right? Secondly, we tell you that religious gay people are much more likely to do things like go to church on our side of the house because the movement itself doesn't actively oppose this, right? You're no longer like shunned by the movement. this means that there's much more direct exposure for these groups to members of the movement. This also looks like what we tell you that the movement itself is much more likely to want to directly interact with religious people because they don't view them as an enemy, right? We think that these kinds of programs don't happen on their side of the house, but specifically because of this like neutrality and not wanting to engage with religion. We think at this point, we are much more likely to win religious people to our side of the house, right? What this means is that we get far more support from these groups. We do not lose support from any other group precisely because of what we tell you on why they support the same core tenets, right? We also tell you that religious people within the movement, they're not traumatized by religion itself. They're likely to be traumatized by specific individuals who have used religion as a weapon. We think that it's good for this reason as well, that the movement centers religion and talks about it more, because they're able to differentiate these two things and not look upon religious people as a whole as an enemy. This again leads to much more dialogue within the movement on our side of the house, leading to much more support from religious individuals. Thank you.
I would like to thank Proposition Reply Speaker for that fine speech, and I would like to thank you all for this amazing debate. Do we have a breakout room perhaps for deliberation?